The scenes just shown may have produced different emotions in you, such as tension, fear, or adrenaline for the characters on screen. To explain this, in 1977, Christian Metz developed his theory on how spectators identify when watching films, proposing that we regress back to a mirror stage when watching and identify with the point of view of the characters on screens. However, what if someone doesn't identify with the intended characters? Theorist Manfred Diawara criticized Metz's theory, suggesting that black spectators were not considered in these previous analyses, proposing that race, gender, and sexuality may result in different readings of the same material. To argue his theory, Diawara looked at D.W. Griffith's The Birth of a Nation to show how aspects of a dominant film could be read differently from the perspective of a black spectator. He refers to the scene of Little Sister's death whilst being pursued by a black character, Gus. We witness Gus chasing an innocent white girl. Diawara suggests that the dominant reading for all races and genders was to have spectators hate Gus, who represents absolute evil, and in turn identify with the little colonel, who represents absolute good, when he seeks to restore order to the South through the discipline of black people. Diawara, in response to this, develops the oppositional reading of the African American, arguing that black spectators would refuse to suspend their disbelief as they are unable to identify with the characters presented on screen, who have been constructed through a white gaze. He comes up with the term resisting spectator to describe this denial of the dominant reading. Diawara additionally uses contemporary Hollywood as an example to argue that the dominant cinema situates black characters primarily for the pleasure of white spectators. He refers to how black spectators resist the dominant reading of many films where black characters are often made less threatening to whites by white domestication of black customs and culture, as well as the use of narratives that depict black characters playing by the rules of white society and losing. Diawara states that it cannot be assumed that black male or female spectators share in the pleasures which some films are able to offer to white audiences. Returning to the scene shown at the beginning of the video, how might the notion of a resisting spectator apply to a 20th and 21st century film? Jordan Peele's 2017 award-winning horror film Get Out attempts to subvert viewer expectations by inviting black spectators to find pleasure through the identification with a black protagonist. We are introduced to Chris Washington, played by Daniel Kaluuya. Chris represents the average African-American male who has to overcome the fear of visiting his girlfriend's family. Black spectators are able to identify with Chris, who is shown facing discrimination.
Sir, can I see your license, please?
Wait, why?
And liberal racism.
I do know Tiger.
Get Out also uses a relatable narrative to help with identification, aiming not to divide spectators. Peele states that anybody can relate to the fear of meeting your potential future in-laws for the first time. One key moment is when, through Chris's gaze, we notice when he is dealing with microaggressions at the party and how it is problematic.
But now the pendulum is swung back. Black is in fashion.
Presented through a close-up of Chris's confusion in these moments. The sunken place takes this idea further, using secondary identification to place spectators in Chris's position. Described by Peele as a representation of the way the US system silences the voice of minorities, black spectators identify with this depiction of their struggles, while Peele also states that, "I also wanted it to be an inclusive movie. You can ask a white person to see the world through the eyes of a black person for an hour and a half." White spectators are positioned to see through Chris's eyes, to be educated and also understand his situation better. Identification is, however, purposely made problematic for white spectators through Chris's girlfriend Rose Armitage, who is often shown defending Chris, gaining spectators' trust through virtue signaling.
I asked to see his ID.
Yeah, why? That doesn't make any sense.
Here.
Rose works as a trap for white spectators, as when she is revealed to be straight up evil, Peele states that there is this trend in race-driven movies where the last good white person can't be racist. The reveal is a subversion of expectations in the horror genre. If the trope had been used, these spectators may have taken an oppositional reading where the black character shouldn't need to be saved by a white character. With the climax of Get Out, spectators witness Chris fight against society and white supremacy, literally killing it in order to survive. Chris enters a predominantly white area and doesn't conform to their norms. Black spectators find pleasure through this ending that challenges the expected result for a black protagonist in film, shown winning instead of losing. An alternative ending further supports how black spectators found pleasure through Chris's win, as this other ending shows Chris being arrested by two white cops. While a powerful statement on the current US society, it would have potentially led to an oppositional reading from black spectators who, as one comment here sums up, expected this bad ending, but had been led up to this point to identify with and believe Chris had a chance to win. The film would have supported Diawara's argument that black spectators cannot find pleasure through a black character, as his loss would have instead been a brutal reminder of modern society. One article talks about how Peele was worried about the original ending, stating that the acceptance of killing other white people in Get Out is dependent on the audience seeing the abuse that Chris's character is subject to over the course of the film. This awareness of causing oppositional readings is why, throughout the film, white spectators are positioned to identify with Chris, while also rejecting the Armitage family's motives through the complicated and absurd body snatcher narrative that keeps them far enough apart from coming across as a depiction of every white family. As a result, their gruesome murder feels justified to all spectators alike. The 1992 horror film Candyman, directed by Bernard Rose, also attempts to address race issues within society at the time, set around the infamous area of Cabrini Green in Chicago. But how does an older film go about addressing this subject, and is it as successful? In the pursuit of uncovering and disproving the Candyman urban legend, protagonist Helen Lyle, played by Virginia Madsen, ventures to Cabrini Green along with her black friend Bernadette. The area is introduced with an establishing shot similar to Get Out, where just like with the title credits, the protagonist is suggested to have travelled far from their comfort zone, placed now in an isolated and foreign area consisting predominantly of the opposite race. Like with Get Out, secondary identification places the spectator in the scene to raise tensions and produce our fear for the characters. Spectators are encouraged to identify through this fear for Helen when gang members surround and call out to her and residents seemingly appear out of nowhere to make us jump. Candyman's attempts to go against society's bad depiction of Cabrini Green is introduced when Helen meets Anne-Marie McCoy and Jake, two characters that show spectators the innocent and realistic, unfortunate lives of the people living in the projects. Despite this, author Tanana of Do takes an oppositional reading to the scene, stating that the projects themselves come across as their own monster that is barely addressed in the film. While also considering the film's depiction of the residents as living like animals, she resists the depiction of the black characters and their home. Director Carl Franklin, in response to Candyman, also stated that there's no question that this film plays on white middle-class fears of black people. It didn't work for me because I don't share in those fears. Carl Franklin takes an oppositional reading as he cannot identify with Helen's fears of this predominantly black area. As a result, Cabrini Green to some comes across as a narrative threat that instead of being a social commentary is there for white spectators to find pleasure in the venturing into. One article addresses how Helen causes problems with identification, a perpetrator of white colonial aggression, although several black women characters advise her against intruding on community spaces and disrespecting sites of death.
What's the problem? Well, a woman died in there, leave it.
She pushes forward with her research agenda in hopes of publication. There is resistance from black spectators who cannot identify with Helen, whose motives feel selfish, seen taking photos like a tourist and using the resident Jake for her own selfish gain. Candyman, by many accounts, was well received by black spectators, as spectators were introduced to the first ever black horror monster played by Tony Todd. Jordan Peele in one interview says that,
"We didn't have a black Freddy. We didn't have a black Jason, and it felt very cathartic."
Black spectators found pleasure through Candyman, seeing a black person as the killer for a change, considerably the highest position of power in a horror film. Despite this, Carl Franklin suggests that Candyman himself falls into the stereotype in which he becomes obsessed with Helen, a white female character, something worryingly reminiscent of films like King Kong and The Birth of a Nation. Tanana of Do also suggests that Helen's character unleashes Candyman, who goes on to kill innocent black characters such as Bernadette and even steal a black baby, later saved by Helen. Another stereotype of black on black violence, which for her created further problems of identification for black spectators. If Helen hasn't been identifiable to some black spectators throughout the film, then where is pleasure left to be found by the end of the movie? Overall, while Get Out and Candyman were both progressive films that intended to challenge white spectators and invite black audiences to find pleasure through watching, Get Out, with its incredibly well received reviews and awards, is suggested to have succeeded in depicting modern society and racism through a black gaze, inviting all spectators to identify and leaving little resistance to be made. Candyman did succeed in the first casting of a black horror monster. However, the dominant reading of the film is ambiguous and led to mixed responses where Helen's white gaze and surrounding narrative proved problematic for some black spectators to identify with. These issues would be addressed in a modern sequel to Candyman directed by Nia DaCosta, where the story is presented through a black gaze. DaCosta said in an interview before the film's release, "With a film like this that traffics in black pain and trauma, it's imperative that it's told from a black point of view. It's imperative that we consider the audience for whom this film could be harmful."